everyone. So, Rabbi, I should share my screen.
Yes.
Yeah.
Let's begin. It's wonderful again to have us all together. Day 4. Let's check out Jerusalem, right?
Okay. Can we all see Jerusalem?
Yes.
Give it the thumbs up. So let's do the muting again, folks. So, like I said, my backdrop today is New Jerusalem, if you like, the Knesset, Israel's Parliament building, the Israel Museum, world-class museum, which we're going to visit a little bit later in our tour. Of course, the image that many people have when they talk about Jerusalem is of the old city, is of the grandeur, mystery, longing of the old city. And what we're looking at in the old city is a place called the Citadel of David, Migdal David. It has nothing to do with David. The city of David, which we're going to visit in a few minutes, is on the other side of the city. When European explorers arrive in Jerusalem in the 1800s, they see a citadel, a fortress, and they know their Bible, which tells us of the citadel that David built. They name this area the Citadel of David. And I wanted to start with that idea today because Barcelona is a wonderful city. Paris is a wonderful city. New York is a great city. Nobody learns about those cities in Sunday school. Lviv, which we visited just yesterday, is also a great city. No one's learned about Lviv in Sunday school. Jerusalem carries with it a whole lot of expectations. Whether people are Jewish, or Christian, or Muslim, they have learned about Jerusalem. They have expectations of Jerusalem. I mean, Jerusalem is much more than a city. Jerusalem is also a concept. Let's go to the classical Jerusalem scene. We'll focus in and come down in a few minutes, look a little more closely. What we can see over here is the Kotel, Western Wall, the central remnant of the temple used to stand in Jerusalem, the focal point of Jewish life until today. When I go and visit a temple or synagogue in America, is almost always oriented to the east. Every synagogue that I grew up with in South Africa was oriented to the north, because all synagogues are oriented towards Jerusalem, and in Jerusalem they oriented to this plaza that we can see right here, which is the Western Wall. You can notice, of course, behind the Western Wall, the Golden Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And further in the distance, you can see the Mount of Olives, which is a very important Christian site, including the steeple that you can just see peeping up above the trees there, which is the Church of Ascension, where Christian tradition holds Jesus ascended to heaven after his resurrection and his time on earth. That's what I was saying. In Jerusalem, poet Yehuda Amichai says the air in Jerusalem is saturated like the air of an industrial city with prayers, because it's that central, it's that important. And that's the difference between Jerusalem and the other cities that we visited. We'll come back to the Kotel from a little closer and we'll talk about it as well. Let's go back to, or let's go forward just 2 weeks to Pesach. You know, I've been touring this week. My schedule for tomorrow and Sunday is to start Pesach cleaning. which needs to happen. Pesach is coming up. We'll sit around our tables. Hopefully, we'll sit around our Zooms if we still can't sit around tables this year. And at the end of the Seder, we say, next year in Jerusalem. And the picture at the top is a wedding where traditionally it was the role of the groom. Sometimes in weddings today, the bride and the groom have a role of breaking a glass to remember the destruction of Jerusalem. And that's why I was saying that Jerusalem is not just another city. Jerusalem is full of expectations. And when we come to Jerusalem, we normally stand on one of the hills overlooking Jerusalem, and we get to say, wow. In the Jewish tradition, the way we say wow is Shehechianu. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, shehechianu v'kiyimanu v'higiyanu lezman hazeh. Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who has granted us life, sustained us, enabled us to reach this occasion. Shehechianu is a prayer we say when we have wow moments. And standing, one of the overviews, the one we're standing on today, is on the Mount of Olives. We're now looking the other way from that picture that was taken. Last picture we looked at. We can see the Golden Dome, and behind the Golden Dome, we can see the gray dome, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And behind the old city, you can see some of the skyline of the new city, some of the buildings of the new city. The Golden Dome, the Dome of the Rock, stands on top of a place which is called Temple Mount, or Mount Moriah. According to Genesis 22, Abraham takes his beloved son Isaac to Mount Moriah in order to sacrifice him. He binds him, he does not sacrifice him. In the Jewish tradition, that is the site where the temple was built, on Mount Moriah. Muslims have the same tradition, but the Muslims tell the story with a different son. The son the Muslims are talking about is Ishmael. It's the same mountain. And the Christian telling of the story, the son is Isaac. In the Jewish telling of the story, God does not want the sacrifice of a son. In the Christian telling of the story, God wants a different son to be sacrificed. And in fact, the gray dome, just behind the Golden Dome, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, is a traditional site that commemorates the crucifixion of Jesus, and we'll get a little bit closer to it and talk about it more in just a few minutes. Okay, so here we actually see a mosaic on the floor of a synagogue. When we were in Galilee, we were looking at the floors of synagogues decorated with mosaic. Here is, again, a very simple, fairly primitive mosaic that tells the story of the binding of Isaac, but the binding of Isaac is a central image in Jerusalem, and Mount Moriah is a central place in Jerusalem, Holy Mountain. Let's move on, or let's move back, and we're going to take just a second to look at the map before we actually see the artifacts. What we can see here is the original city of Jerusalem. Firstly, just to orient you, this white line that we can see over here is the line of the wall of the old city today. The old city today is not in the same place as the original city of David. The original city of David is south of the old city of today. And the reason that the original city of David is where it is twofold. Firstly, there is a spring of water. Cities in antiquity were always built where there was a permanent source of water. They couldn't, like us, build a city and then desalinate or bring a pipe, dig a well. They could only build their city where there was water. But also, there are two valleys. There's the Kidron Valley, which is marked on the map, There's a second valley, a small valley on the other side, simply known as the valley, or the valley of the cheesemakers in the Christian Bible. And so this was defendable because it has water and it has valleys for defense. It's also accessible. No good is so defendable that you can't get the merchants arriving in your city with the goods. Jerusalem was a great city. City of David, the area marked in purple, probably has between 900 and 1,500 people. The size of my high school was midway between those two figures. That's the size of the city of David. After David's death, his son Solomon will expand the city to the north onto that mountain and build a temple. The city will continue to expand northwards into some of what is the old city of today. It happens step by step and gradually. Now, one of the problems that the city has as it expands is the city of David, you can see, is above the spring. The job of the girls was to go every day to the spring, but what do you do when the city is besieged? What do you do when there are marauders outside? And so later in time, they need to work out a way to get spring into the city. Just take one more look. This is a model of the city that exists in Jerusalem today. And I want to show you on the model David's palace or fortress, probably where the stronghold of Zion was, the citadel of David was. So we know we're not even in the old city. We're on the other side of the old city compared to the one we saw before. I want to draw your attention to the wall. We can see on this map, there's a wall there, support wall, to hold the fortress up. Archaeologists have uncovered this massive support wall today, and the ceramics enable us very, very easily to date that wall to the very, very early Iron Age, the end of the Bronze Age, round about 3,000 years ago, round about the 10th century BCE. So it would very well work with David. Anyway, let's get back to the challenge of the water. Several generations later, a king called King Hezekiah, one of the great grandsons of David, realizes that if he doesn't solve the issue of access to the spring, the enemy will get the water. This time the city has expanded. There is a wall over here. And so he decides to build a channel underground. There you can see some people walking through the channel. And the group that were with me, it was winter time. We did not walk through this channel. And because you can see the water is about knee deep. Water still flows through this 2,700-year-old channel called Hezekiah's Tunnel. It is round about 1,600 feet long. It's 533 meters long. And the gradient is 12 inches, 30 centimeters. So it's barely flowing downhill. It's enough to get water to flow from spring to the pool. The metaphor, understand this engineering, the space shuttle. This is cutting edge engineering. They were able to understand geology. They were able to get two teams working towards each other, a team being from the side of the spring and a team being from the side of the pool, and they met in the middle. And water flows very, very gradually through the tunnel. But then it does now. This is a tunnel called Hezekiah's Tunnel. Now, I said it's about 1,600 feet. The actual distance from point to point as the crow flies is about a third of that. The tunnel is much longer because it winds its way along. And one of the questions we've asked is, why does this tunnel wind its way along? One theory is there were two teams digging towards each other, and they were listening for the other team and then adjusting their direction that they were digging in. And certainly we can actually see the evidence of false starts, but that probably only accounts for the middle where they met, because they had to make sure that the two teams met. Why is there this big loop over here? Turns out the rock is harder in this section. And they had enough geological understanding to know they could go around the hard rock and connect up with the other group on the other side. Despite Hezekiah solving the problem of the water, well, when he solves the problem of the water, the Assyrians do not destroy Jerusalem. 150 years later, the Babylonians do destroy Jerusalem, and the Jewish people go to exile. Not for long, because they come back from that exile and they rebuild the city, not once, not twice, 3 times. What you're looking at is the model of Jerusalem. This is a model of Jerusalem which stands at Israel Museum. We're going to get to the museum. We won't see the model then. It's a model of Jerusalem as it looked in its heyday, on the eve of its destruction in the year 70. And what we're looking at is the temple. And the buildings with the red roofs behind the temple was the affluent neighborhood and the priestly neighborhood where the Kohanim lived. Now, just to give you a sense of size, it's estimated that the temple was between a third and 50% bigger than the Golden Dome of today. And we saw how impressive the Golden Dome looked, and we're going to see it again in a few minutes. You can really get a sense of how impressive this temple would have looked like 2,000 years ago. The temple was built on top of Mount Moriah, on the same place that the earlier temple had been built. This temple was destroyed in the year 70 by the Romans on a day, the same day that the first temple was destroyed, according to our tradition, on a day called Tisha B'Av, 9th day of the Hebrew month of Av. And what you can see in this image is a site that has been excavated. The road that we're standing on is the same road that people walked on in the time of the temple, that people walked on in the time of Jesus. And Jesus used to come to the temple. And those massive stones that you can see, part of the support wall that held a massive platform on which the temple sat. The stones that you see were knocked down by the Romans, and they've been lying there for close to 2,000 years. The wall behind these stones is the Western Wall. And if we could remove this earthen ramp, we would be at the Kotel, at the Western Wall, at the holy site, the accepted holy site. This area has become the area in which non-Orthodox egalitarian services are held. So many of the people that I guide, if they want to have a bar mitzvah, they want to have a bar mitzvah, want to just have a symbolic community service on their own, this is the area that we go and do it. It's next to the same Western Wall. And next to these massive rocks that fell here. Now, we're going to continue exploring And here we can see again, I don't know if Adrian is with us today. If not, like I said, these are her pictures. Whenever you see people in the pictures, they're the pictures that she gave me. Here, a group of people standing, a group of women standing at the Western Wall. And what you can see is that the Western Wall has stones of different sizes. You know these people, so let's concentrate on the wall behind them. Okay, there is stones of different sizes. The small stones at the top, clearly a later addition. It was put there at the same time as the Golden Dome, which you can just see peeping up at the top, was put there. In fact, that's the level of the platform. Make sure that people don't fall off that platform. The big stones are the same kinds of stones that we saw lying in a pile just a moment ago when the temple was destroyed and the stones came falling down. But this is certainly a remnant of the temple as it stood, the platform that held up the temple. What you can also see is that there seem to be only women at the wall, because this image is taken at an angle that shows us the women's section. This is the women's section of the Western Wall. And here on the other side is the men's section. In fact, if you see the divider, it's not dividing it up 50-50. It's dividing it up probably 70-30, the men's section and the women's section. I don't have an issue with how the Orthodox want to divide their space up. If they want to divide their space up 70-30 and the Orthodox women are happy with it, that's fine. I have an enormous issue with the fact that there's no section at the Western Wall. People like me pray in egalitarian services, pray together. We can go down to the Southern Wall, to that area that we saw just before, and like I said, many of us do. This remains an issue, and this is an issue that has been picked up by a group of women who are called the Women of the Wall, and they will pray for 11 times a year. They don't do it on Rosh Hashanah, but they do it on the other 11 Rosh Chodeshim, in leap years on the other 12 Rosh Chodesh, on the new year, new month, and they will come and have a service at the Western Wall. Now, the Western Wall doesn't end. We'll see more about that in a moment as well. Western Wall doesn't only have that southern part that's been excavated and the holy site of the Western Wall that we saw. In fact, it continues for more than double the length that's exposed to the air underneath the Muslim quarter. And because people live in this quarter, the Western Wall is exposed in looks like a mine shaft. On the right-hand side is the actual Western Wall and supports holding up, concrete supports to hold up the neighborhoods above us. On the left-hand side, concrete supports. This is something that enables us to explore and see the enormous scale of the platform, the Western Wall. And this is actually all the way at the end of the platform. We're standing on a street, and in the first picture, that's a concrete floor. Now we're standing on a street again, and we're standing on that same street that we were standing on when we saw the massive boulders, massive building stones that had fallen down, had been knocked down by the Romans. And as you can see, the guide, me, in the picture, is holding my hand at an angle to explain that there is a slope. And when we were on the street earlier, we were on the bottom end of the slope, and we're now on the top end of the slope. We've reached the same street, built with the same kind of paving stones. Remember, if the city of David between 900 and 1,200 people, 900 and 1,500 people. Herod's Jerusalem, king who builds the second temple, Herod's Jerusalem has 150,000 people. And 3 times a year, that number triples. Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot. Pilgrims come from all over the world, and the number of people in the city balloons out, and they need infrastructure to cope with all of these people. Think of the entrance ways into and out of the stadiums where you go to a ball game, because everyone's leaving at the same time. Everyone's coming at the same time. And so too with Jerusalem. They had massively broad streets that were broader than the streets of the old city today. After the temple is destroyed, the Jewish people go to exile in Rome. And what you can see is the Arch of Titus, and an image on the Arch of Titus showing the menorah being carried out of Jerusalem. And what happens then, and this goes back to what I said before about direction of prayer. The rabbis determine that when one prays towards Jerusalem. Those that are standing outside of the land of Israel should direct their hearts towards the land of Israel and only then pray. As it is said, and those that pray to you by the way of their land. And those that are standing in the land of Israel should direct their hearts towards Jerusalem and only then pray. And it goes on and goes on and goes on, ensuring that Jerusalem is the focal point. But for 2,000 years, there were very few Jews living in Jerusalem. Most of the Jews were living in the diaspora. Most of the Jews were living in North Africa or in Europe. And other people came to control Jerusalem. So what we can see over here is the Church, the Holy Sepulchre. This is a picture that could only be taken during the COVID crisis, unfortunately, because it is empty of the hundreds of people that are normally milling about in this plaza. The building itself was first built in the Byzantine period in the early 300s. Queen Helena, mother of Constantine, comes to Jerusalem in 323. She understands that this is the site of the crucifixion, and the Christians build a church. That church stands until the Muslims destroy it. What we're looking at is mostly the Crusader church, and these arches, the Crusader era arches, one of the clues of Crusader arches is they have a slight point to them. They're not completely rounded. And the church is a maze inside. It has the site of the crucifixion, Calvary. It has the stone of the unction, where Jesus' body is washed before he's buried. And it has the sepulchre, the burial cave in which Jesus is buried. And from a Christian point of view, this is a very, very important site, especially for the pre-Reformation churches, for the Catholics and the Orthodox and the Armenians and the Copts and the Ethiopians. And it's an unusual church because all of those denominations that I mentioned have standing inside this church. But the dominant power in Jerusalem, actually, was, of course, the Muslims. Here we can see from up close the Golden Dome, Dome of the Rock, which stands on a rock, the same rock in the Jewish tradition that Abraham brings Isaac to, bind him. In the Muslim tradition, in chapter 17 of the Quran, Muhammad makes a midnight journey from the sacred mosque to the distant mosque, and the distant mosque in Arabic is Al-Aqsa, the edge. And from this mosque, which is just a mountaintop, he ascends to heaven, comes face to face with the prophets that preceded him. And the shrine that we see was built to commemorate this event. You'll notice decorated with mosaics, decorated with lots and lots of calligraphy. Visitors can go up and walk around the Golden Dome. There was a time, if any of you visited Israel more than 21 years ago, between 1967 and 2000, non-Muslims could pay an entrance fee and at very specific times of the day go into the Dome of the Rock. That is no longer possible. So non-Muslims can go up and walk around the platform, but cannot go into the mosque. What happens is, we spoke about the Jews going to exile, and when they talk of coming back, and we meet once again Theodor Herzl, an important guy in this country, and Jewish nationalism develops, it's called Zionism. Why? Well, what's significant about the name? Name is Jerusalem. Jerusalem has another name, and that other name of Jerusalem or Jerusalem is Zion. Zion is a synonym for Jerusalem, and although Herzl is a very secular man, don't let the bread mislead you. He was a very, very secular man. He was deeply rooted in Jewish ideas, and he sees the return as something important. And we spoke yesterday about the early pioneers who came, yesterday and the day before, about the early pioneers who came and settled. Now notice, we spent a lot of time on the early years. We took a few minutes to talk about the Christians and Muslims, and then we've leapt into the modern age. Now, of course, you could do, and I have done, a semester course on Crusader Jerusalem, or on Byzantine Jerusalem, or on various different Muslim rulers who ruled Jerusalem. But we don't have a semester, so we're looking at highlights, and we're going to continue with what happens to Jerusalem when the city is partitioned, when the country is partitioned in the United Nations on the 29th of November, 1947. On the 29th of November, 1947, the United Nations votes to partition Palestine into a Jewish state marked in blue and into an Arab state marked in orange. The city of Jerusalem is meant to be an international city, corpus separatum, not part of the Jewish state, not part of the Arab state. It's a terrible map. It's a terrible idea. It's November of 1947. There are hundreds of thousands of survivors still languishing in displaced persons camps in Europe. We accept this map. The Arabs reject the map. A war begins. And at the end of the war, Jerusalem is part of the state of Israel. The map is redrawn. The old city is part of Jordan. So the development in the city begins to be development to the west. Very early on, we have the parliament in Jerusalem, but the parliament is not in the building that you can see behind me. And in the picture, that building is only completed in the 60s, but it's built in West Jerusalem. That, of course, is Israel's Knesset building, Israel's parliament building, which is about to have its fourth election in 2 years. A very unusual situation that we've had. It's the situation we face. Now, if we were standing, as you can see actually in the picture behind me, you can look from the Knesset to the Israel Museum, or look from the Israel Museum to the Knesset. And the idea of the Israel Museum is that we are rooted here. And the idea of the Knesset is that we've come back to be sovereign here again. Very symbolic idea. We know that there are archaeological remains that show that the Jewish people were here. We just looked at many of them. That's part of the story of the Knesset and the Israel Museum, looking out one onto the other. You can also see, standing in front of the Knesset, a menorah. I'll take you back for a moment to the Arch of Titus, which is in Rome, but which was included in our, instead of me holding up a picture, we saw it on the slide. And when the Romans destroyed Jerusalem, they symbolically carried the menorah out of Jerusalem to show the destruction of Jerusalem and the removing of any sign of sovereignty from Jerusalem. And of course, standing in front of the Knesset today is the emblem of the state of Israel, which is a menorah. The Israel Museum itself is commemorated. It's now more than 50 years old. It was opened on the 8th of May, 1965. And as they came up to 2015 and to commemorate their 50th anniversary, they decided to give free lifetime membership to anyone who was born on the 8th of May, 1965. I was very annoyed because I was born on the 6th of May, 1965, so I missed out 2 days. But the truth is, licensed guides get free entrance to the Israel Museum anyway, so I didn't really need it for entrance purposes, but I thought it would have been kind of cool. What kind of museum calls itself the Israel Museum? It is an encyclopedic museum. It's not an art museum or a history museum or a Judaica museum. It's an art museum and a history museum and an archaeological museum and a Judaica museum. The director of the Israel Museum, James Snyder, was the deputy director at MoMA in New York and was on track to eventually be the director there. They offered him this job. He took it, left New York, and came to direct this museum, which is considered to be one of the leading museums in the world. What can we see in the museum? We'll just briefly look at 4 elements of what we can see, and we'll start in the top right. You can see a stone with an inscription on it. The inscription is very unclear. Even if this was a full-size slide, it's very difficult to see the inscription. They rubbed some chalk, white chalk, onto 6 letters on the inscription, and you can clearly see those 6 letters. Now, those of you that read Hebrew will not be able to decipher this Hebrew, because this is ancient Hebrew. This is the Hebrew that we used until we went to Babylon. This Hebrew becomes defunct in 586 before 0. Written on this stone, 2 words: Beit David, the house of David. Now, if you've heard that term before, it's because that's what the Bible uses to describe kings of Israel after David said. King Hezekiah built water tunnel was of the house of David. We use it today to talk about the House of Windsor, ruling in the United Kingdom or somewhere else. And so this stone is incredibly significant as the earliest external corroboration, not of the miracles in the Bible, of the text of the Bible. The image on the left, I'm not going to spend too much time talking of, because when we were down in the desert, we spoke of the Dead Sea Scrolls, but the Dead Sea Scrolls are housed over here in the Israel Museum as well. The third image is a synagogue, an Italian synagogue. The Nazis killed the Jews, the synagogue remained intact, and the synagogue was removed and brought to the museum and rebuilt, and they have 4 different synagogues from 4 very different parts of the world and from very different time periods in the Judaica exhibition of the Israel Museum. The last image is an image that was sculpted by one of the early Israeli sculptors by the name of Danziger, and it is a sculptor called the Hunter, Nimrod Hunter, and he has in his mind, this is what we once looked like, and this is what we need to go back to being. In other words, part of Danziger takes that Zionist idea that we're not going to just sit around and read books, but we're going to be strong and farmers and defend ourselves and all of that, and he expresses it into this kind of art. And indeed, the Israel Museum has a massive collection of Israeli art. It also has Van Gogh and Rembrandt and Picasso, and also has a modern art collection and other art collections as well. Marvelous, marvelous museum. If we go further west to the other side of the mountain, we get to a mountain which is called Mount Herzl, or Har Zikaron, the mountain of memory. And Mount Herzl has a tomb of Theodor Herzl, the guy we just saw with the beard and that we've met on some of our other days. Herzl dies in Vienna in 1904. He is buried in Vienna, and he lies in Vienna until his body is exhumed and brought to Israel in 1949. And buried on a hill that is then given his name, Mount Herzl. Most of Mount Herzl, though, is not a burial site for Herzl or for other leaders of state, because many other leaders of state, we saw Ben-Gurion is not included, but Rabin or Peres or Golda Meir and so on are also buried on this mountain. But most of this mountain is the military cemetery. This is Israel's Arlington. And you can see the row of tombstones in the second picture, which are military tombstones. A family who lives in Eilat or lives in Tel Aviv, and that they lose someone in the military, they can choose to have that person buried in a cemetery close to them. Any soldier from anywhere in the country is eligible to be buried in the Mount Herzl cemetery. When I say any soldier, someone who's actually serving as a soldier, because most of us, myself included, spend time in the military. Once you're no longer in the military, unless you were a general or a high-ranking officer, you're not buried in the military cemetery. The second part of Mount Herzl is Yad Vashem. Yad Vashem is the National Holocaust Memorial Museum, archive, teachers training. It's a whole campus to do with Holocaust. And kind of strange, because it's not something that happened in the land of Israel. And yet I think it's very obvious to all of us that national monument needed to be in Israel. And Yad Vashem, which is a couple of lines from the book of Isaiah, which means a monument and a name. stands on the same mountain, Mount Herzl. Now, we can't see it, a visual of it right now. Mount Herzl is on the very western edge of the city. Mount Herzl has the western slope. Those who never saw the dream, Yad Vashem. Top of the mountain, Herzl, the dreamer, and the eastern slope, those who paid the price of the dream. And that's why it's called the Mountain of Memory. And all of our national ceremonies, Memorial Day for Fallen Soldiers, Independence Day, Holocaust Memorial Day, all of those days, national ceremonies are held on Mount Herzl, which is why I called it an alternative holy mountain to the Western Wall complex. Mount Herzl is connected by the Jerusalem tram system, the Jerusalem light rail. It's the last stop. Soon it will not be the last stop. Soon the train will go even further, but at the moment, it's the last stop on the western edge of the city. But one can get on there and ride all the way across to the old city. Now, the Jerusalem tram runs like it's just about to be expanded. But if you want to understand Jerusalem, it took way longer to build the tram than we expected. That's not unusual. Infrastructure projects often take much longer. If you want to understand, Jerusalemites were betting that the Messiah was going to come before the train. Because in Jerusalem, the sense for many of the people, sense that Messiah is coming. Jerusalem is a very, very religious city. And if yesterday we were in Tel Aviv in the swimming pool and on the beach and cycling, that is not the ambience in Jerusalem. Now, one of the remarkable things about the light rail is the light rail enables Arab Jerusalemites, ultra-Orthodox Jerusalemites, and secular Jerusalemites to ride together. Jerusalem is, of course, also filled with markets. And this is the market in the old city, the Arab market, the Shuk, which is a favorite place for people to spend some free time trying to get bargains, and everything is, there's no fixed price, everything is negotiable. Jerusalem is also one city, two peoples. The map with the colors that you can see at the bottom shows blue blobs and green blobs. Blue blobs are Jewish neighborhoods. Green blobs are Arab neighborhoods. Most of the Arab neighborhoods are Muslim, but not all of them. The red square in the middle here is the old city. And the green line that you see over here is what was Jerusalem until 1967, when it was a divided city. So until 1967, we only had access to this part of the city. We didn't have access to the old city, and we certainly didn't have access to near the neighborhoods on the other side. And there is a tension in Jerusalem. There's also a practicality of people who live together. If you were to be sleeping in a hotel in Jerusalem, many of the wait staff at breakfast, many of the people, reception desks, would be Arab Jerusalemites. If you happen to get sick, need to go to the urgent care on a Friday night, most of the doctors and nurses that will be on that shift will be the Arab doctors and nurses. So there is interaction, and you can see the interaction when you see the Arab woman holding the little child with the pink top on, is also holding a bag from Fox. Fox is a fashion store chain in Israel. So there is commercial interaction between the populations, both because people work together, they live in very distinct neighborhoods and function in different languages. The Jewish kids go to school in Hebrew, the Arab kids go to school in Arabic. That tension sometimes flares up, but mostly it is manageable. There is another tension, of course, which I alluded to before and which people have asked about, and that's the tension between the ultra-Orthodox and everyone else, all the other Jewish sections, but especially symbolic with the image at the bottom, which is of some of the women of the wall who are having one of their services at the wall. And this tension was, this experience was shared by a number of the women from our group, and many of the groups that I go to Jerusalem with try and time their visit to coincide with Rosh Chodesh, with the celebration of the Hebrew month, where the celebrations go at the wall. Now, truth be told, most, not all, most of the women at the wall are either visitors from out, I'm talking about the progressive women, reform women, either visitors from out of the country or immigrant women. Not because the issue is not important. But for people who live in Israel, this is seen as more of a symbolic issue. The wall is more of a symbolic issue, and practical things like adoption. In Israel, there are, which is a good thing, there are way more people who want children than there are children available. So 80% of adoptions are overseas adoptions. Almost none of those overseas adoptions are children that are born Jewish. Now, it's not complicated to convert the child when you come back to Israel. You have to commit to raising that child in an Orthodox home. No one comes to check. If you want to adopt a second child, you do come check. That issue annoys Israelis much more than the status of the wall. It's symbolic, and I understand the symbolism completely, but I want to give you an inkling into why this is more of a Western Jewish issue and less of an Israeli issue. By the way, in fact, in Israel, which we share with Afghanistan and Iran, you can only get married in a religious ceremony. There's no civil wedding. So I can get married in 17 different recognized Christian denominations, or Sunni Muslim, or Druze, or Orthodox Jewish. That issue is a much bigger issue for Israeli Jews in the Western world. I'm not knocking it. I'm explaining why most of the women that you see, Orthodox women coming to, in their terms, defend the wall, and why there are not enough yet Israeli liberal people prepared to go out and fight for the rights of being at war. It's a complicated city, Jerusalem, but it is a city that many of us love, and I love Jerusalem, as the sign says. I want to take us back to where we started, which is next year in Jerusalem. And I know we've already spoken with the rabbi about the possibility of next year in Jerusalem, whether it's next year or another year. After that, hopefully soon we'll be able to get together in Jerusalem. I'm going to stay on in a minute. You can see over there, and if you don't manage to get it, the rabbi has it, Suzanne has it, my email. If there are questions, if people have comments, if people want to follow up on something, I don't always make this promise, because when I'm guiding full time, I don't always have the time, but in Corona times, I'm more than happy to answer any questions that there may be. So I'm going to stop the share, and I'm happy to take any questions or comments that people may have.
Mookie, it's Linda Novak. The very first picture you showed of the Citadel of David, is that where we saw the laser show?
Yes.
Okay.
That is Citadel of David is a place where we have where they have a laser show on the walls of the Citadel called the Night Spectacular.
Uh-huh.
Adrian actually does have a picture of it, and I was thinking to include it or not include it. But, we only had an hour, so I didn't. Absolutely, that is the venue you worked out, Linda.
Okay, thank you.
Do they recognize,
Yes.
do they recognize Reform Judaism more than they did, say, 30 years ago?
Who's
Or even
they?
more than last week.
Who's they?
Israel.
Okay, so there is a paradox in Israel that 20% of Jewish Israelis would define themselves as Orthodox.
20%.
And within that Orthodox, I would say about 70% of them are ultra-Orthodox. 60, 70% of them are ultra-Orthodox. And they set the tone on those kinds of issues. Most Israelis are secular, and let's not get too stuck on what the word is, because everyone's cleaning their houses right now. Everyone's hoping that we're going to be allowed to have regular Seder's this year, because it's like putting up a Christmas tree. People who put up a Christmas tree aren't always religious Christians, but it's what you do at that time of the year in that context. So very secular Israelis. The question is complicated because it comes down to recognizing Reform and conservative rabbis who cannot carry out weddings in Israel officially. They can carry out weddings, but the people that have their weddings have to still have a secular wedding by an Elvis impersonator in Vegas, fly over to Cyprus and have a wedding done by the mayor of Cyprus in Nicosia, a civil wedding, which is then recognized by the state of Israel. So many of my friends, my son's bar mitzvahs were done not in Orthodox synagogues. I go every week. I'm a regular, but not in Orthodox synagogues. So there are Reform and conservative and non-defined, like non-committed synagogues in Israel. We don't have official standing. Now, the big issue is also now to do with conversions. And the Supreme Court last week recognized conversions carried out by Reform and conservative rabbis, or the Reform and conservative movement. And for most Israelis, this is fine. Most Israelis, this is not something that, even within the Orthodox, there are people who are okay with it. It is a wedge issue. It is a political issue. And the coalition, our system of government, has its flaws, the same as your system of government has its flaws that allow someone who gets less votes to win an election. Our system of government allows small parties that help someone get over 61, which is the number you need to have a majority. We have 120 members in the Knesset. If you've got 56 and you need 6 more, and there's an ultra-Orthodox party, they have a lot more power than they may have. But I think the winds are blowing in the right direction. I think we could still have setbacks. I think the winds are blowing in the right direction. There are more and more. When I arrived in Israel 30 years ago, if you went to a Reform synagogue, rabbi had an accent, either a German accent from the old generation or an American accent because they'd come from America or England. That's not the case. There are tens of graduates of the Reform and conservative yeshivot are Israeli born. They don't have an accent. No one can accuse them of being inauthentic. But change is coming slowly. You know, but it is happening. One other thing, in my synagogue, which is 100% egalitarian, girls all have mitzvahs where they read from the Torah. In secular Israel, 90% of boys will have a bar mitzvah. They'll go to the synagogue for the one day and have a bar mitzvah. It's not a big deal, though. They can read Hebrew. They just have to learn a tune. Not hard. Almost no girls will go have a bar mitzvah, and most of those boys will go have that bar mitzvah in an Orthodox synagogue because it's the default. Yeah, it's not an ideological choice for these people, and they're annoyed by the involvement in weddings and in the lack of serving in the military and a whole lot of other issues. So it's complicated. I have a whole session on it, so we're not going to go into it now in more depth. But I have time for one more question, if anyone else wants.
Could I ask something, please, Mookie?
Sure.
Sure. This is Dick Brook. For non-believers to visit the Mount, I know there are certain hours. How common or uncommon is it? And what I'm getting at is, would you be the singular non-believer there, or is it a common thing? Would you feel funny doing it? I understand that's individualistic.
So there are very specific hours from 7:30 in the morning till 10:30 or 11, and it varies seasonally, and then from 1 until 2:30 hours where non-Muslims can go up to the Temple Mount. And in busy tourist seasons, there's a line, what I often do if I've got a group that wants to do is we go at 6:30 and we get to the front of the line, we do the tour, and then we go back to the hotel for breakfast. Because if you arrive at 7:30, the tourist season, you can spend an hour standing on the line before you go in, because there's a very, very rigorous security check. You can't take up, you can take up a bottle of water and a garment, but if someone comes with a bag, they will go through the bag item by item. And so it takes a long time to go up. But there is a little bit of tension up there. You cannot go up with a Bible. You cannot go up a Hebrew Bible or a Christian Bible. So there is tension around there. But, in tourist season, there are lots and lots of people that go up. In the COVID season, we've had less people going up because the kind of place that, again, many Israelis have been to once. They check the box and not going back there. The Israel Museum has different exhibitions every few months, so you can keep going back there. Okay. So it's been my pleasure to give you this little taste. When we did the trip, Rabbi, I think it was 10 days, 11 days, 9 days. I don't remember, but it was certainly a lot more than 4 days, and certainly a lot more hours than we've had. I hope you've got a taste, and I hope that we get, as I normally teach a Hebrew word every day, or few words every day on the bus. Because we only had an hour, I didn't do that. But the Hebrew word that I want to teach for those who don't know it is hitraot. And lehitraot means until we see each other again. It's au revoir. There's no English expression for that. Of course, in the age of texting and kids, no one says lehitraot. They just get with lehit. Who's going to waste 3 extra letters on their screen? But I'm old school. So I say lehitraot. I hope to see you on Zoom and or preferably in the flesh sometime soon here in Israel.
We're still looking at 2022.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Mark
Enjoyed
your
it.
calendar, Mookie.
Thank you, Mookie.
Bye.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
It's wonderful.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
Well.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Very much.
Hi, Teresa, thank you for
Pleasure.
work we did before as well. Rabbi,
I'm
you don't
sorry.
have side effects. Said, "Bye, I hope you don't have any side effects.
Oh, thank you. I do appreciate that.
They're worth it if you have them because, you know, we've got to beat this. So
Absolutely.
It is-
It's definitely
it is
worth
what
it.
it is.
For sure.
Good. Okay, night.
Good night, Leet Jote.
Right.